having been at school. Where teachers were constantly telling him he was thick. So he wasn't, by any stretch of the imagination, the best student we had, but he was holding his own, he was fine. He had this thing in the back of his mind. He was thick. So again, a lot of people kind of bring baggage from school days or beyond into their return to education. So lack of confidence, bit of apprehension caused by that, and the concern is the other commitments. People typically coming back into education are, if they're coming back in as adults, typically coming back in part-time, or even if they're coming in full-time, you have the whole shooting match of wife and wains and or whatever there. So people are concerned then about other commitments. How am I going to manage alongside these other commitments that I have? And that leads us then to this big issue of the grid. Feels as if I should play sort of dramatic music when we come to the grid. So you're asked to think a little bit about going back to study, this formative exercise of the grid. So how do folk get on with that?
My week's not too bad in terms of structure. Unlike architects who are trying to build, if they run out of ground, they go up. There's an option. You've got time, and there isn't any more of it. So it's how you fit it in. And the task for me was actually very good because I looked at where I had dead time. So in parenting, Tuesdays and Thursday nights, we have a boy who is a goalkeeper and trains Tuesdays and Thursday nights, and I take him because Dawn has other activities. But I'm either standing at the side of the pitch or I'm sitting in the car. So I now have an hour and 40 minutes on a Tuesday and Thursday night where I'm reading. And it's just working out where's the dead time there could be, because there's no more time to do it as such. It's just how do you jig it.
Okay, how do other folk find the grid?
My week is Julie's a nurse, and so she works shifts. And so the idea of saying this Tuesday or 3 Tuesdays times, so I think for me, over the years, I just have a system that works for me. And so I know that I have, just kind of follows in, I know I have say 10 or 12 hours a week that is empty time. It's just that I need to be disciplined that whenever that time is there, that I don't use it to do something that's not productive.
Anybody else on the grid?
I'm actually really finding how fortunate I am actually now, just from listening to my colleagues here. It's just I don't have those commitments. I mean, my grids, I suppose I changed it slightly, so I basically broke it down and sort of numbered them as day 1, day 2, because work day is going to be that. I mean, by the time you're out for travel and getting settled, I mean, that's fairly rigid. That's pretty much 9 to 6. And that's usually allowed even if time runs over a wee bit with work. And then you kind of got the 2 study days, which again, I kind of look at them from the point of view that even with library time, I mean, there's enough time sort of after class where, especially if you're kind of feeling a bit G'd up and you kind of get educational mode on, you're like, that's a great time to kind of keep the flow going. My big thing has always been in sort of that, as I put it down, as day 6, the day off, because my natural inclination is to kind of just go with the flow of my day off, whereas I'm looking at it now, I'm like, that's the one day where I really have to be intentional about how I do it. And just managing even one of the things I sort of talked about was like church commitments and things like that. If I'm involved in youth, it's fine because that's basically just a Sunday, and you kind of know in advance what, if you're going to be talking, what the talk's going to be on. One of the things I probably had to look at was even in terms of like, because I'd be sometimes involved with the praise band, straight away all of a sudden that's a Friday evening practice, and pretty much your Sunday morning all the way through, and I'm like, those kind of things then can have, a sort of impact on sort of the quality of the rest of your Sunday, because usually you're exhausted, done 2 mornings with a practice, things like that there. So it's really just managing even just those side of things as well, and just kind of saying that it's great to still be involved, but how you you sort of, you know, it's kind of what Phil was saying about the time, you don't get more of it.
Yeah.
It's about saying, okay, well, how do I best use the time that is available, and how do you serve within that sort of, with all these different competing ideas as well.
Anybody think, how on earth am I going to fit this into my week?
Yeah, I mean that bottom right hand corner Saturday afternoon is pretty much, that's where I have to carve out the time. That's the only slot in the week where I can carve out time,
Yeah.
and even that is a challenge.
Yeah. And again, that's not untypical, of, again, part of the value of doing this exercise. I think it's not untypical of people finding, the problem here is not that I have too much time on my hands. It's my life's already rammed pretty full, so that becomes an issue.
And when I was looking at this, the word for me that came up quite solidly was discipline,
Yeah.
and linked to that is discipleship. And so looking at the week in the grid, obviously I've had a look at the three strategies: work, rest, and pray.
Yes.
Okay, getting involved, getting down to doing the work, but also standing back. And that's what I've been thinking, to look at this grid and say, okay, where can I build in those rhythms that's going to be positive?
Yeah, I think that's a helpful point to make. That you do in the midst of all this kind of need a bit of thinking space as well. You may be able to set aside a couple of days or a day or whatever it might be to do some of these things, but you also kind of need to allow yourself a bit of thinking space as well. So that might happen in the car, or the bus or whatever, where you have some time to reflect on those. But you do need that kind of I think a bit of head space as well. And not just think in terms of, well, this is the afternoon I've set aside to do this, or the morning I've set aside to do this, or whatever, and that's the time. You do need a bit of kind of head space as well to kind of think about some of those issues and reflect on it. And again, I think that's important if you're going to benefit from the study, and it's not simply going to be, well, this assignment to do. I want a little bit of time to sit back and to think and reflect on some of the issues that are raised. So hopefully, you found that helpful. At least to kind of think. You may have found it depressing as well, but just to think about it a little bit at the start of your studies. And time management, without doubt, is the biggest issue you will face. You're part-time with other responsibilities, so managing study time will be crucial. And probably, as you think about your life now, as I say, it's probably already quite full. You have a lot going on. As Phil said, clearly you can't create more hours in the day, so therefore it's almost inevitable that as you embark on this course of study, something else will have to go. And you need to think, what needs to go? So you're committing yourself to this for 2 years or 3 years, whatever it might be. Is there something here that has to go? And what's that going to be? What could I do without in my life for the next 2 or 3 years that would create more time for study? You can't get rid of your wife and children, Stephen. Sorry about that. So what needs to go? Just to think about that. So again, you're going to spend time. You're going to spend money. This is an investment for you over the next 2 or 3 years. So do think in terms of what needs here what needs to go here. If you're going to study effectively, you do have to set aside extended periods of time for study. It's interesting you say about reading during a football practice, and you can kind of fit things in like that. You can read an article on the bus, but largely you do need to set aside periods of time for study. And again, that requires forward planning. When will you study? So you do need to think about that. And again, we're back to this kind of organisation, as Miriam said, the kind of the discipline that goes with this. When is that going to be? And to set aside some time to that. And since this course lasts 2 to 3 years, you will also discover that time management is an ongoing problem. Over the course of the years, things will change in your own life. Also, the course itself will change. The third year, for example, of the MA, you'll no longer have modules but a dissertation. And many people think typically I have a year to do that, or 9 months, or whatever it is. As a result, they procrastinate and then find they haven't left themselves enough time. Again, that's been a typical experience. So how will you change? How will you respond to change over the course of your studies? As things change, how will you respond to that? So you do need to think about those kinds of questions. Are there things in my life that need to go? When is the time when I will study? And how will I change as the course changes, as my life changes, as we go over the next 2 or 3 years? Any other questions or comments about that? Closely related to the idea of time management then is target management. And you also find that this is something you need to learn. In other words, you need to match the task to the time available. You need to match the task to the time available. Again, that may not be something that's immediately obvious to you, but you need to learn it quickly. It's a case really of on-the-job learning. So you need to think about questions like, how much time will it take you to find a resource? So again, if you're coming into the library to do some work or to pick up books, you need to factor that, think about that. So it's not a case, well, I need to read this book. You need to think about things like, well, I have to go to the library to get that. So, how long is that going to take? When's that going to happen? So you need to think about how long it takes you to read. How long does it take you to read a book or an article? Again, that's something some of you will maybe learn as you go along. How long is this going to actually take me to do this? Think about that. How long is it going to take you to write 4,000 words? That's something again. That again, some of you kind of have some idea maybe from more recent study. Well, I know I can write an essay in, but again, for some of you, you will have to kind of learn and think about that. How long am I going to have to set aside for that? And probably there is a bit of, you'll only learn by doing, a little bit in your first few modules. So you need to create targets that are suited to the time available for them. And again, you're best to think in terms of what you want to achieve, rather than the hours you put in, which are often rather nebulous. What do I want to achieve? And how long is that going to take? Rather than thinking, oh well, I need to put in. If I'm not doing 20 hours this week, well then, that's a waste of time. What do you actually want to achieve? What's your target? I recall when I was an undergraduate, there were students who used to queue up to get into the library come exam season. You can see them all queued up there for the 9 o'clock opening. And if you spoke to them, I was in the library all day. I was in the library all day. Library didn't close at 10 o'clock, and I was there all day. But the reality was, if you went into the library was like a ghost town. It was like a ghost town. For whilst they thought they were studying, they spent large chunks of time out for coffees, out for lunch, seeing their friends. But they had this kind of idea in their mind, well, all day in the library. No, you weren't. You were doing all kinds of other things. Yeah, you were there and you claimed your desk so that nobody else could use it. And it sat there for all day, but you weren't there. So that idea, what do you want to achieve? We all like to beat ourselves up a little bit and kind of say, oh, you have no idea. I really need 20 hours to do this, or I need 10 hours to do this, or whatever. But again, that idea of what's the target? What do I need to do? And kind of match the target to the time available. 2 don'ts to think about. First is, don't waste your time worrying about how to get everything done. The best way to do a thing, Bishop J.C. Ryle said, was to do it. So don't sit around worrying, how on earth am I going to get all of this done? Just do it. That would be a good ad for running shoes or something. Just do it. Secondly, don't get frustrated. Don't get frustrated if your timetable doesn't work out, because it won't. Your timetable won't work out. All kinds of things happen in life, as you know, and things will blow you off course. So don't let that get you frustrated. You kind of, if that happens, hit the reset button and think, well, what do I do? What do I do now? So don't get frustrated. Some not so big, I would say, but nonetheless important issues are study habits. So we're all different, so you each need to establish study habits that work for you. Johnny has already hinted at that. So you need to think about, where will you study? So where's your study going to be done? So some of you will already kind of have study facilities available, but where are you going to study? So you need to think about that. The setup. Are you going to have a chair? You need a chair and a desk. Do you need a room to do that in? So where will you study? Think a little bit about that type of question. Think too about what time you will study. What's your best time of day for studying? Best time of day tends not to be after you've had that large lunch. So you've done eat out to help out for lunch. The best time might not be then to go and study, and you will find the head begins to droop maybe a little bit. So again, what time of day do you study best? I'm kind of trying to think about that. An important question: who do you need to notify? Who do you need to notify? So that might be, if you're working in a church, might be able to say, make an arrangement with your office bearers and say, look, Monday morning is my study morning, or whatever. Could I arrange to not have calls, texts, and so on, or whatever on that, or see people block that out. So that might be that. Might be, say to your wife and children, to go, I'm studying now. Can you not disturb me for the next couple of hours, or whatever it might be. Or you could be like me, Stephen, and
I just think of how many times I'm already saying that.
you could be like me and just, my wife always says, look, when you're sitting doing something like that, and if a bomb went off, you wouldn't notice. The children were younger, she would say that the house is falling down around, your children are running around like a bunch of red Indians, and you haven't even noticed, so it's, so some people have the capacity to switch off, but again, you need to notify people and say, look, this is time I'm setting aside, and switch off the mobile phone or whatever, and go and do that. Okay, another thing you need to think about then are techniques, study techniques. And again, these are related to the particular study task. How do you set about writing an essay? So again, it might be some time since some of you have written an essay, and you might be thinking, not sure know how to go about that. So you need to think a little bit about that. How do you write an essay, and how do you plan, and so on. So we'll have a session tomorrow on essay writing and reading for essays and so on. So hopefully that'll give you some help. But you do need to think a little bit about how you work. You know, what suits you. You know, what kind of what way are you going to write an essay? How do you take notes? What format will your note taking class? Are you going to put pen to paper? A bit of friction helps you to write and remember. A lot of people, bring their laptop or whatever and do that. What's the best means of doing that? So what's the best way for you to take notes in class? What you will see really from, hopefully we'll have this rolling out by the end of this week, but certainly in the future lectures, is lecture notes will go up electronically, so you'll be able to access them. So we don't tend to give handouts, so you will get some access to stuff online. So again, just thinking about how are you going to take your notes? Are you going to sit in front of a screen and drift off, or are you, I say, you're going to kind of do some writing, create some friction, and do that. How will you organise your materials? So how will you store your study materials? Over the years I have been a great fan of, I'll remember where that is, and then discover I haven't. So you do need to think about organising your study materials. John Stott said that a filing system is where you lose things alphabetically, which I can identify with. So how are you going to store your study materials? Are you a kind of a file and folder kind of guy? You're going to do things electronically and create folders on your computer or whatever. So again, just thinking, some of those kind of practical techniques that you're going to use in terms of study. So from what we've looked at, much effective study is really related to personal organisation and forward planning, to that discipline that Mearns talked about earlier. And if you neglect these things, you will struggle in this course. There's no two ways about it. The people who struggle are the people who kind of neglect to plan and get organised. So you really need to think about that and work that out. Okay, any questions or comments? Okay, final little comment then about working with tutors. As staff, we're committed to making your postgraduate experience as positive as we can. So our aim as a college is not to put pressure on everyone to be an academic high flyer, but we want to develop your potential as a learner. Now, some of you may excel at this level of work. Some of you may find yourself struggling a bit, but our aim as a staff really is to help you develop at whatever level you find yourself at. So that's really what we're seeking. So again, a bit like my friend said, you'll think I'm thick because I'm only getting whatever his score was. It's not at all, what we were thinking. So we knew a bit about him, we knew a bit about his educational background, we knew where he was at, and we were very, very comfortable, thought he was doing pretty well. So I say our aim is not, so if you're not scoring 75 on every essay, we're not thinking it's about a waste of time. So it is about helping you develop where you're at and making the most of your educational experience here at college. In order to do that, we do rely on you working with us. So this is not the school where you do your best to avoid the teacher. So portrait there of the principal, but you're not trying to avoid the staff, and if you're anything like me at school, you're always trying to avoid the teacher, avoid his or her attention. So if you're struggling, we need to know. If you're struggling, we need to know. If you cannot make a hand in, we need to know. And part of our experience, again, over the years has been, if students are struggling, sometimes they just go off the radar. They just disappear, and we're sending them emails, it's getting into the great void, or we're texting them, and nothing happens. And to be honest, that's no help to the student. That's no help to the student. And we cannot help you if we don't know if there's a problem. So if you're having a problem, do get in touch with us. If you're struggling in any way, get in touch with us. Because the sooner we know about issues, the better. And we can try and help them, help address those. And again, we want to work with students and help them as much as we can. And we do realise that you're part-time, and other things can get in the way of your studies. So if you're struggling, please get in touch to chat things through, and we'll try and help in whatever way we can. So people will typically say, look, my essay, contact me and say, look, my essay was due in next week, but suddenly I discovered it's written the final version, and then I have a funeral this week, it's not going to happen. We understand that, or something comes up in work unexpectedly or whatever. Yeah, we get that, and I'll say we will try and work with you as far as we can in doing that. So if you're struggling in any way, if you're under pressure, if you're difficulties with a hand, then get in touch. And I say, you will find that we will be as sympathetic as we can be. Okay, before I give you a closing little exercise, any questions or any comments about this morning? Nobody completely terrified then? Well, this is only a kind of I always say in cricketing terms, a gentle loosener. There's more ferocious fast bowling to come. Okay, we're going to break here and have coffee in about 5 minutes or so. As I said, we'll serve that outside, and you can say maybe get a breath of air, whatever. But before we're doing that, I'll just leave you this final little exercise, just to take 5 minutes to do this, just to reflect on this morning, just to reflect for a few minutes on this morning. So the thing we've done, we've had the study skills lecture. So that's what we've done. So review it for a moment or two. Have you learned anything this morning that means you need to change? Okay. Have you learned anything this morning that means you need to change? So think a little bit about that. And then finally, a little plan. What do you need to do to implement these changes? Okay, so just for 5 minutes, as I just kind of do that little exercise. Study skills lecture, the thing we've done. Have you anything that means you need to change, and how do you plan to do that? Okay, and I'll see if I can go and rustle up a cup of coffee for you. Okay. For Mason and Letitia, if they're online out there in the in broadcast land, we're having a break now until 11:30, and you can come back and tune in. And also, if you two guys have any questions, you can email them into me, and I'll do my best to answer them.
laptops and if I dig yeah, no, I'll probably have to go look. This is where I should be taking specs of everything I do.
It's a really good idea because I've seen that in other classes. I just take it off,
Just stop something. Right, that's okay. So
I'd still be 2 meters away sitting on that back table.
yeah, sure. Yeah. So are you back in the building yet, or?
Yeah, we went back sort of in the middle of August, and I think for us it was definitely the right thing to do. And so far so good. You know, people are they're behaving themselves. You know, as such. You know, it's hard. You sort of wonder sometimes what people's thinking.
Yeah, you do.
You know, they want to take risks, work away, but don't do it with anybody else. You know.
It's just all online. If you went to the, completely safeguard and all the rest of it, it just goes a little bit.
Okay,
It's not meant to be like that.
no, and every when you would, you know, you hear somebody coughing and I have to go and get a test. Well, it doesn't mean to stop.
Tell them about it. That's like your flu since last year now. Every morning we wake up and go, is that worse or what is it?
Maybe I'll get a test this week.
I'll just permanent.
You're back this week, isn't it?
The event on Sunday night for meeting,
Okay.
and then from Sunday it's the evening services that will be streamed as well. But we're still doing the recordings for September mornings. Yeah, all right. After the funeral, 2 weeks back, after, so after push things on a bit, and fought our guys in from them, and Yoli goes knee boss, he does
Was that right?
training. Then Yoli does knee boss training for the Lisbon City Council, so that's where he works doing that whole thing down. So he's on
That's
board with it, you know, yeah, the proper risk assessment and yeah, personally I wouldn't quite do as much as they're doing, but you know, it's being done. That's the main thing. And whatever for us. That's important. Professional day, can you sing?
Well, the hard folk say, I said yeah, but you know, you can't.
Yeah, it's you know, that's the question. And Dave is always asking for Dave, just asking what it is, and it's asking Dave himself. so much. Thank you.
Sorry, thanks.
There's somebody there, Louise.
There it is, yes. No, it's the guy who's in front of me dropping off because his mother's getting married.
Oh, Alex.
Alex.
He's not even going to leave for this session, but sure. We'll give him stuff. Stuff and ask him.
Do you know that I was sitting out there and got struggling
A couple other things for you too. Super. Sorry for the long.
Thank you. Fantastic. Cheers. Got it? Try not to take them all.
I'm still moving too tight. Okay. Good. Alex, I believe you are deserting a sinking ship.
I heard you were speaking, so I'm leaving.
Aye.
Yes.
Okay, way to Fermanagh, are you?
Yeah, well, I'm travelling back to Bangor here to pick up some stuff.
Uh-huh.
First of all, and then I meet neighbour in Fermanagh
All
at past 3. So,
Very good.
45 minutes back there, quickly get a bite to eat, and then head down.
And don't forget to wear your name badge so everybody knows who you are.
I'll wear that tomorrow.
Keep that, wear that.
I've already had several jokes about that. Make
Yeah.
sure you're marrying the right twin. Super. Thank you very much.
Okay.
We'll be in touch anyway.
Yeah.
See you Sunday.
Okay, Alex, yes.
I think the assignments are maybe up on the middle page already.
Okay.
So you'll have access to that. You'll just keep using the same number. So,
Okay, super. Cheers.
but yeah, if you want to come back to me about what's involved, sure come in.
No, it's fine. Super. Thank you. Cheers.
Okay.
So, need to do that and that.
What? Show me again? What did you just do?
That, start recording. That's recording the lecture and then.
Where was the cursor there?
That was the other thing. That's you up and running and then. So this is your PowerPoint. Oh. Yep, so that's your PowerPoint. And you just use that then as usual.
And where's the stream?
The streaming just goes on in the background. If you need to do anything with the streaming, you hit that, the Windows key, and that will take you onto that. But just let it tear away in the background. Yeah.
And I know what's happening.
No, you don't. You ignore that. You need that for your PowerPoint.
Okay, as long as the streaming's on.
Yes, the streaming's going on in the background.
Good, thank you, my man. Wonderful.
Yeah, fantastic. Alright, children. I could have buried in that, I don't realise who it was.
Young John.
He challenged me to get a pool and was he went off. Well, I can just go out. There was not a wing mirror or squabbling. The car was
Can't go back to work.
I don't get a break. And then you can open the sanitizer.
All right, everybody, welcome back to this second session in your study skills program. I hope that Letitia and Mason can see me and hear me. I'm not sure how I'll ascertain whether that, hopefully that's going okay in the background. I'm sure if there's an issue, they'll contact David upstairs. My name is Edwin Ewart. I'm the principal of the college here. I teach a variety of subjects, theology principally, and some homiletics, which is the science of preaching, and some of our pastoral ministry subjects. And then all of the tutors here really dip into this business of study skills, so I've been asked to do this one on critical thinking. I'll say just a snippet about myself. You've all introduced yourselves this morning, have you, at the beginning? You've done that? Yes, good. So I'll say just a little bit about myself. I was born in Cookstown. This man's pleased because that's his part of the world. My growing up in Mackerfelt, but also my dad moved about with work and one thing and another, and I grew up in Mackerfelt, and then went to the Baptist church there. I was brought up among the Christian Brethren actually, and my mother's still in the Gospel Hall there at Ockram near Mackerfelt. But I moved with my sister and then later my brother to the Baptist church. Principally for the reason of playing football, because I met guys there in the Baptist Youth Fellowship who played football and were Christians, and previously I wondered, could those two things be compatible at all? And then I realised they could be. And so I joined the Baptist church initially not particularly because of conviction, but I say this slightly mischievously because of football and friendship. And then the convictions really came later. After school in Magherafelt, I went to what was then grandly known as the Ulster Polytechnic, it's now the University of Ulster at Jordanstown, to do social work. I had no notion of doing social work. I had aspirations to be a history teacher, and then I made a mess of the A-levels. And now, tongue-in-cheek, I say, I'd love to have my A-levels remarked, going back to 1977, because everybody now is getting their grades remarked. And wouldn't that be wonderful? And as one of our management board said to me, look where you are now, and imagine if you'd really, done well. So I went there, did social work, worked for a couple of years in Carrickfergus in social services, and then went to Irish Baptist College to train for the ministry. I had that sense of call really from the beginning of the time at Jordanstown, and then began to get a little bit of speaking experience in the Christian Union, which was seminal in my experience being involved in the CU there at Jordanstown. I pastored 3 churches, started in Letterkenny and Donegal. We've just come back, we were there this weekend in Donegal, and went back to the church, now meeting in the Radisson Hotel because of the pandemic. And it was lovely just going back there and hardly knowing a soul and seeing the multicultural nature of that wee church now, which was. So we started there and then went to Mount Pottinger in Belfast, 100 miles. That was totally different setting. And then after that, Coleraine, the longest pastorate I was involved in was Coleraine Baptist. And then the longest spell of ministry has been here in the college. I've been here since 2007 and I've been the principal since 2010. Married to Alison, 3 grown-up children, 2 grandchildren who started school today. I've got the photograph here, not go down that road. And 1 other grandchild on the way over in England and due about a week's time. And we're not sure how we're going to get across to see the baby. It's all of this is up in the air at the minute. Anyway, that's me. We sometimes ask for an interesting fact about somebody. I don't know why David asked you that this morning, an interesting fact about yourself. Well, that's good. I'll give you an interesting fact about me. For 20 years, I've just retired. For 20 years, I have been a chaplain to motorcycle road racing in Ireland. So that really has brought me down in your estimation. I'm sure you're saying, what sort of an idiot does that kind of thing? I don't race, but we're there to support these families who sometimes find themselves in very traumatic situations, and there you go. Anyway, I did 20 years and I felt I'd done my bit, so I retired and gone out to pasture.
You don't play guitar as well, isn't it?
Sorry?
You don't play guitar as well, that's just seems to be the underlying current here.
No, I don't play. I play piano very badly. I need a long time to learn a piece. So there you go. Okay, so lovely to be with you today, and I hope that this material doesn't seem too dry to you, but as David has probably explained, it's very much part of the foundation, the building blocks of being able to do postgraduate study. Don't get too... the danger is sometimes where folk begin with this, and you need to, is that you get a little bit worried about it. And you might go home after the first day saying, oh, what have I got myself into here? I would say to you, be patient. Don't be too worried. Don't fret about it. Remember also we're a small community here. And if you want to talk to somebody about it and get a bit of help and support, we're here for you. It's different to the big university context in that regard. But you will be able to do this. Just have a little bit of patience, and the penny will drop, it'll start to fall into place, particularly in this area that we're going to be thinking about today, which is the essence of postgraduate study, critical thinking. Now, I've given you an outline on your seat. One is the PowerPoint slides that are coming up, and beside that is some space for you to write notes as you wish. And then there are a couple of other handouts as well. And these have been emailed to Letitia and to Mason, so hopefully they can do that as well. The first thing you want to do is have the PowerPoint slides outline available, and then if there's anything you want to jot down from what appears here, or anything I say, then you can jot it down. Okay? Now, we begin then with Stephanie Reisner, This is from Watson and Reisner's book, Developing Skills for Business Leadership. And Stephanie Reisner says critical thinking, reading and writing are the pillars of postgraduate study. The pillars of postgraduate study. You know that believe that the earth is built on pillars. And actually the psalmist in the Old Testament has this idea of the earth standing on pillars. And of course it's a poetic way of speaking. It doesn't mean that they're literal pillars. But there are, not literal, but certainly intellectual, metaphorical pillars that undergird postgraduate writing are those pillars. Moving up from undergraduate study to postgraduate study is a wee bit of a jump. So I wouldn't want you to think that it'll be exactly the same as any undergraduate study that you did. At undergraduate level, you can get away with writing descriptively. But the crunch issue for postgraduate work is this business of critical thinking. This is, as Reisner states, the mother of postgraduate skills. Just up front to hit you between the eyes with that idea, and I'd like you to keep that in your mind as you work through this program that you've signed up for. That what I really need to do in any piece that I submit, in any book that I read, in any discussion that takes place in the class, what I've got to do is get under the skin of the subject. So it's not just analysing it, saying, why is that happening? Is there another way of interpreting that? What's the underlying bias or assumption here that this person has as they've written this book? You've got to get under the skin. I will develop this a wee bit more in the lecture this morning. Critical thinking, you may know, sometimes has a negative press among evangelicals. So our heritage here in the Irish Baptist College is a conservative evangelical bias. That word conservative, by the way, if I could emphasize, is not capital C, it's lowercase c, conservative. So we're not a political party here. That's not our beef at all. But the word conservative, which is used sometimes as a preface to the term evangelical, means that we have a high view of Scripture. It means that we believe that there are no mistakes in the Bible, that the Bible is supremely authoritative for all matters of faith and conduct. That's really what that word means. But this idea of critical thinking sometimes has a very negative press among evangelicals. So you can talk to some people who are evangelicals and you say, we're doing a class this morning in critical thinking. They raise their eyebrows. They imagine that what you're trying to do if you do that is to undercut the authority of Scripture. It's seen as being inherently critical of biblical authority. But there's no necessity to think like that. Criticism, in the sense that we are talking about in this genre, is analytical. It seeks answers to the question, what is really going on here? See this on the screen and on your handout? It's analytical. It seeks answers to the question, what is really going on here? This criticism is undertaken, this is very important, in the spirit of curiosity rather than reproof. Now, I think that's a key thing. I sometimes use a yellow highlighter when I'm reading or preparing notes, and I think I'd put my yellow highlighter under that, because whenever we talk about critical thinking, or you look at a theological textbook and you're reading it critically, it doesn't mean that you're trying to undermine it necessarily, but it means that you're reading it and investigating it in the spirit of curiosity. The real goal of criticism then is to further our understanding and to open up completely new lines of inquiry. J.I. Packer, whose name you may be familiar with, once said that the alternative to critical thinking is gullibility. You know what a gullible person is? Someone who believes anything and everything. You know, you could tell them anything and they'd suck it in. But Packer says that the alternative to critical thinking is gullibility. In case you're not familiar with Packer, Packer died recently, might have been just in the last month, actually. I saw a little note in a magazine I read. Jim Packer was an Anglican, went out to Canada, much to the shock of the Anglican and evangelical constituency in Great Britain. And he spent the greater part of his ministry out in Regent College, Vancouver. And he wrote extensively on the inspiration and authority of Scripture. In my view, the Christian church owes an enormous debt to Jim Packer. And so I sit up and take notice when I hear him say this. The alternative to critical thinking is gullibility. Critical thinking is essentially about learning how to process the materials that we study. So here's a statement from the National Council for Excellence in Critical Thinking. Who would ever have believed there was such an august body as that? And this body has said that CT, for the abbreviation, critical thinking, is more than the mere acquisition and retention of information alone, because it involves a particular way in which information is sought and treated. That's quite a significant statement from that organisation. And then to supplement that, to add to it, a statement from Queen's University, the Learning and Development Service at Queen's, says that critical thinking essentially means asking questions of your reading material. Instead of accepting things at face value, you should look for the evidence and reasoning behind the claims. Now, both of those statements, I think, if you combine them together, give a very helpful kind of definition of what critical thinking is. Or if you prefer something a little bit more literary, and perhaps something that triggers your imagination, here's something from Rudyard Kipling. Who was Kipling? Kipling is not the guy that makes the cakes, by the way. That's Mr. Kipling, okay? So Rudyard Kipling was an English journalist and writer who was born in 1865 and died in 1936. He was born in India, and so he always had a tremendous interest in all things Indian and Eastern. And a number of the books that he wrote reflected that, and the pieces that he was the author of reflected that. He was famous for, well, quite a bit of stuff really, but I pick out two fictional pieces that he wrote. One was the Jungle Book, and I asked myself this week, when was the Jungle Book written? This has nothing to do with your study skills, but the Jungle Book was written in 1894. I can hardly believe that, and probably the reason I can hardly believe it is because I've just probably watched the Disney version with my grandchildren. And The Man Who Would Be King, 1888. Wow, who'd have believed that was so long ago? But here's Kipling, who is very helpful to us on this matter of critical thinking and study skills. He says, I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I knew. Their names are what and why and when and how and where and who. Have you heard that before? Does it ring a bell? Well, if not, there's another yellow highlighter piece in the notes, because to me that sums up what you're really trying to do is you read a piece, particularly in your reading. Now, Sarah Dalrymple will be talking a little bit in another lecture this week, a couple of lectures in fact, about reading, how to read, and no doubt she'll touch on this kind of thing. But asking these questions are absolutely crucial. In fact, if you're a preacher, these are very important questions to ask of the text, because what are you going to be preaching about? You're going to preach the text of the Bible, hopefully. Not just your own notion or what you read in the newspaper last night. That might help to give you illustrative material and condition a little bit what you do, but the text is going to be the guide. And so how are you going to approach that text? Is it just up for grabs? No, ask these questions of it. What is this about? Why was it written? When was it written? What's the literature here? Is it poetry or is it wisdom literature? Something like that. Where were the people to whom this was addressed? Were they in first century Corinth or somewhere like that? Well, that's going to tell you a little bit about why the author wrote like this. And who is this person who wrote and who are the people to whom he wrote? So I think these questions are terrific from Rudyard Kipling. Now, at this point, I'm going to give you a brief exercise in critical thinking. And you'll see that this is coming up on the screen. And for Letitia and Mason, it's there on your outline. So this is quite contemporary. You're in search of a new iPhone. This was me about a month ago, okay? So my old phone wasn't charging anymore. And I thought, what am I going to do? And well, I can't go for another SIM deal. You know the way all this thing goes around your head. So anyway, here's your exercise. You're in search of a new iPhone. You visit phonesareus.com. They claim they've got the best deal going. You can have the phone £40 a month on a 2-year contract. You go, suck your breath in. You say, that seems a little bit more than I wanted to spend. And so you're telling a friend about this over coffee, and they say, oh, no, don't go to Phones R Us. What you want to do is go to budgetphones.com, and they could give you the same deal for £26 a month on a 2-year contract. Now you're in a little bit of a dilemma. So what I want you to do is to write down your initial response to this scenario. What are the questions that you're going to ask about this very common situation? So just take a couple or 3 minutes and write down the questions you would want to ask about this situation. Okay, I'll give you another 30 seconds. Okay, let's turn our attention to this. I've put up 1 to 5 on the whiteboard here. Might be we have less than that or more than that, but let's have a check. Joyce, what would be the first thing you want to ask about this?
There's just that quote coming into my head, about the 6 honest serving men. Some of those questions came to my mind,
Good man.
like why? Why the price difference?
Okay, isn't that an obvious one? Just stop there and I'll get others to be involved. Why the price difference? An obvious one. Okay. Stephen?
Who are the suppliers? What do we know about them?
Okay. So who are these people? who are Phones R Us and budgetphones.com? Are they reliable? You see, you want to know this. You're going to send your money throwing it into a dark hole or something and never see a phone. Okay? Mearns, what would you want to ask?
What does the claim mean?
Sorry?
What does the claim mean? They both claim.
Okay?
Yes. How do they come to this inverted commas claim?
Okay.
Is it-
Yeah. So, it's a wee bit related to the first one, I suppose, but yes, absolutely. Okay. Phil?
Upfront costs or hidden costs.
Are there any hidden costs? Well, we always want to read the small print, don't we? Yeah? Anything else?
I suppose sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. John?
The trustworthiness of your friend, and that his needs may be different than yours, so you've checked out Phonosaurus. Anybody that spells phone like that is to be mistrusted. But it seems in the first case you found out that information yourself. The second comes from the friend. So
You're saying, is this person really a friend or they?
on commission.
Yes, okay. All right. Yeah, okay. Well, look, great. I mean, those are the questions that I'd written down. There maybe are others as well. I suppose you'd want to ask, are you receiving like for like? Are the two phones exactly the same? Because there might be, more bells and buttons on one of them than with another. This kind of thing. So what are you doing here? I mean, it's a very simple exercise. But what is it that you're actually doing? You're scratching below the surface. You're not just taking something at face value. And what I'm saying to you today, as we look at this theme of critical thinking, is that in the same way you would approach this scenario, you will also approach an academic text. You will also approach something on, let's pick out one, something on pastoral care, something on leadership, something on Christology, something on Reformation studies. You're going to come at all those texts in the same way and scratch beneath the surface. Now, a postgraduate student then asks critical questions about the content of the material, the key terms and definitions, the underlying assumptions, the methods used to gather information, the process and approach of writing, as well as the credentials of the authors. You see, that's mapped a little bit onto that previous phones scenario, and you can see that some of the ideas in this quotation are kind of mapped onto that. Now, as we think about this subject today, we're going to look at some of the key steps in this task of critical thinking. And at the outset, I just want to point out, and maybe I've already done this, that there will be a little bit of overlap in terms of reading and writing skills that other lectures are going to be talking about in later sessions. So with that and bearing that in mind, there might be a little bit of overlap. Let's look at the focus of our task. At the beginning, it's very important to have a clear sense of what you are seeking to do. So, you will never be asked this question in an assignment. Tell me everything you know about this subject. Now, it's amazing at both undergraduate and postgraduate level, the number of students who are asked a question. This is their assignment, their essay question. And when you get the piece of work submitted back, you start to read this and you realize that it's just a broad discussion of everything that this person can possibly think about in relation to that theme. Now, that is not the essence of either undergraduate work, frankly, or certainly of postgraduate work. Instead, you need to have a clear sense of what your task is. So, ask this. What is the question that you're being asked to answer really about? Second, what are you hoping to discover in this book or article that you've been asked to look at or review? Third, why have you been asked to read this book? What's its relationship to the subject and the question? And fourth, what areas do you need to cover in order to address the subject? Now, I pause at that last one because in my book, it's important to work out a structure for an assignment. There are some folk and their minds are a bit like a flowing river, and it goes in all kinds of directions. Little tributaries go off, and they're very easily paddling their canoe down a beautiful tributary and losing contact with the main flow of the river. For other people, they're quite mathematical in their mindset. They structure everything. They work on equations. In postgraduate study, a little bit of both is good, because imagination is a good thing. I want to endorse that. But at the beginning, when you're given an essay title or an assignment title, work out a structure. Take a blank sheet of paper and work out a proper structure. Now, basically a structure usually comprises the following. If I can put it here maybe. You've got an introduction. What would be in an introduction, do you think? What would you put in an introduction?
So the phrasing of the question that you're seeking the answer.
What, sorry?
A phrasing of the question you're seeking the answer, what the purpose of...
Okay, so you're setting out purpose. Bearing in mind the question, put that as a cue, okay. You might actually state your conclusion. Now, I'll make this point a little bit later. You might do that. Not always, but you might state your conclusion up front and then support it. So, this is your introduction. Second, you've got the main body of the text of your answer. And that will comprise probably certain key points of information. And then thirdly, you'll have your conclusion. So you're obviously thinking that I'm someone who preaches nothing but 3-point sermons. But actually, that's a very common structure for any essay. And my view is if you stick to that, you won't go far wrong. It will have a coherence about it that might not otherwise be the case. Now, how to write, one of the other tutors will be dealing with that as you come along. So, you need a sense of purpose for whatever you're doing. What areas do you need to cover in order to address this subject? If you don't begin with this sense of purpose and focus, you will quickly be swamped by the amount of material that you're reading. You're never quite sure what do I read now, what bit of that's relevant, where am I going to put this? You need that focus and structure. Sometimes conversations with students go a bit like this. Now, I'm thinking here particularly, though this can happen in the modules, but it certainly happens in relation to dissertation when you get onto that stage of this program. Conversations sometimes go like this. The tutor says, what were you thinking of writing about? And the student says, I was thinking of doing something on the covenant. Tutor says, what were you thinking of doing about the covenant specifically? Student, I'm not really sure. I thought maybe I could look at the idea of how the covenant develops in the Old Testament and then move on into the New Testament and see how it's viewed there. And then I thought, as a kind of illustration of all of this, I might be able to do something on Calvin's view of the covenant and a Baptist response to that. And then finish off with how we preach the covenant today. And the tutor says, and you're planning to do all of that in 4,000 words. You see? This is a module essay. The dissertation is longer than that. But your module essays are 4,000 words. And maybe as you sit here today, you're thinking, how am I going to write 4,000 words? Your problem is going to be how to keep it down to 4,000 words. I can guarantee you that. But do you see the point I'm making? Too broad an idea, it's not going to be workable. So you've got to home in and have a purpose. And what will happen is the tutor, in negotiating your essay title or your area of study for a module essay, will, as I say, negotiate with you and engage with you and help you to narrow it down so you're looking at a particular idea or maybe a couple of particular ideas rather than the whole range of this subject area. So, as soon as possible, develop a sense of purpose and direction in your work, or you will find yourself drifting aimlessly. Then learn how to read critically. Learn how to read critically. You will be, as I say, looking in a little more depth at reading skills, but underpinning all our reading must be this business of critical analysis. And so Watson points out what this involves. First of all, identifying and challenging assumptions, arguments, and conclusions. Everybody has a viewpoint. Now, I mentioned earlier that I studied at the Ulster Polytechnic in social work, and I can vividly remember one of the main tenets of social work theory being the non-judgmental attitude. This was a value that was lauded to us, that was what we were meant to have, a non-judgmental attitude. Now, I can understand where that's coming from, but let me say that it is a piece of humanistic philosophy, because everybody has a viewpoint. We are all conditioned by our background, by our preconceptions, by our assumptions, by all kinds of things, by what side of the bed we got out of this morning. Everybody has a viewpoint. In fact, it's impossible to completely exhibit a non-judgmental attitude. Everybody makes judgment calls about everything. Even those who purport to be the most liberally minded folk in society, their very liberalism is a value judgment. Now, philosophically, you can prove that, of course. I would say, when you're doing your reading, remember that everybody has a viewpoint. It's the question of whether the viewpoint is justifiable, whether it can be supported, whether you can scratch beneath the surface and say, but this viewpoint is not supported by the evidence, and here are alternative viewpoints that seem to call this into question. So we'll have a look at this and give you a couple of examples of it. We often find today that people make strong claims for science, for example, because it's factual. You know how people talk. What did you do at school? Oh, history. That's interesting. They mean it's not interesting, but they say, that's interesting. English literature. Ah, right. Philosophy. Whoa. I did science. Oh, there's a kind of, science is great because it's factual. The reality is, did you know this? There's no such thing as science. There are scientists, and scientists approach their work from a particular point of view. Scientists select the questions they are deciding which facts are relevant. So strictly speaking, there isn't science, but there are scientists who have viewpoints. One health website, let me give you an illustration of this. One health website has an article which is called 6 Reasons Why a Little Glass of Wine Each Day May Do You Good. Another website page has the title, An Extra Glass of Wine a Day Will Shorten Your Life by 30 Minutes. Now, both claim to be scientific. They claim to have evidence by the best health professionals to support their claim. So how are you going to decide who's right in this situation? You've got to scratch beneath the surface. You've got to look at the evidence. You've got to pitch one against the other. You've got to come to your own conclusions as well. The reality is shortening your life by 30 minutes. If you lived for 70 years and 10, the biblical writer puts it, and nowadays we expect people to live a lot longer than that. Shortening your life by 30 minutes might be no big deal. Okay. Well, I'm saying that. Maybe if you were, maybe if you're approaching that last hour, you might say that 30 minutes could be very important. Okay. So identify and challenge assumptions, arguments, and conclusions. Second, evaluate evidence that supports any points that are made, and identify any unsupported claims. So a good academic writer will substantiate his or her claims. However, we must think, because we are the students, we must think about how this writer substantiates those claims. What kind of evidence do they offer? Are they making claims that they cannot sustain? So let me give you an example. If a writer says, Karl Barth is the most important theologian since John Calvin. Maybe these are names that are not familiar to you. Karl Barth, probably the most famous, most prominent 20th century Protestant theologian. Swiss, fascinating character. German originally by birth, lived in Switzerland, very opposed to the Nazis during the war, and has written Church Dogmatics, has, in my view, the gift of being very difficult to read. Those Church Dogmatics are in places almost indecipherable. And yet he has some very good things to say. He reacted against the theological liberalism of the 19th century and early 20th century in a very shrewd and penetrating kind of way, and brought Jesus Christ back into the centre of theological enterprise. His doctrine of Scripture, in my view, is a little bit weak. You see, you've got to be analytical and critical and discerning, but there are some good things in Catholicism. John Calvin, we probably know a little bit more about him, the most systematic of the reformers in terms of the way that he projected his teaching. And so this theologian says, Karl Barth is the most important theologian since John Calvin. Now, on what basis then is that claim being made? That's the first question you want to ask. Second question, who made the claim? Well, you could reverse those two, I suppose. Who's making this claim? Oh, you discover this person has gone to Karl Barth Seminary. He didn't have a seminary, by the way, but here's the Karl Barth Memorial Seminary. So this guy has been steeped in the theology of Karl Barth. There might be something to go on there that maybe he's been a little bit coloured in his outlook. So I think of a theological college in Ireland, where in systematic theology over many years was a prominent Barthian, if you can use that phrase. He wrote a book about Barth. He thought Barth was absolutely wonderful, and a number of the students who sat under him became enthusiasts for Barth. It's just the way it goes. We are impacted, influenced by the people we listen to. I'll give you an example. My spiritual mentor was someone called Pastor Jim Smith, who was pastor in O'Connell and then Macrofelt, where I grew up. And I grew up with his two boys. Tremendous encouragement and help to me. I still have some of his sermon notes. And whenever his son hears me preaching, his eldest boy, who is an elder in a church near here, whenever he hears me preaching, he always smiles at me afterwards, and I say, "Stop that, I know why you're smiling." I say, "You're still like him. He sees his father in me. I don't see it. I can't see it. But he sees it every time he hears me." And so I've been almost subtly, imperceptibly influenced by that. And so we've got to ask this question, who's saying this? Who made this claim? What were the influences that led them to make it? Have they been conditioned by certain things? So you've got to get underneath the skin in this. Next one, third is this, or fourth. Up opposing arguments and taking supporting evidence into account as you read about any subject, you will of course find that you are dealing with competing claims. It's like those two web pages about the glass of wine. Which of them's right? Or does it really matter anyway? But that's another story. Maybe you've been asked to assess which of them's right. So understand that you can be dealing with competing claims. And in fact, I would suggest that one of the things you want to do as you're writing your essays is to introduce competing claims. Don't just go down one channel because you like that argument and find all the evidence you can to support that. Find other alternative views and introduce them, but come to your own conclusion at the end. Somebody said on one occasion, I think it was a preacher who said, I milk many cows and I make my own buttermilk. That's good. You see, you're not just following one track, but you're an eclectic person. You're reading widely and you're imbibing material that will lead you to draw your own conclusions. That's helpful. And then reading between the lines and understanding deeper meaning. Maybe I've gone on too quickly here. Reading between the lines and understanding deeper meaning. Is the writer driven by an agenda? That's a question. Sometimes it's very clear that he is, or she is. So, someone called Strobel, in a book about Jonathan Edwards, entitled The Ecumenical Edwards, says the following. The goal of the following chapters, in other words, his book, is to initiate an ecumenically significant conversation. That's the opening gambit of the book. So clearly there is an agenda there. This writer is going to look at Edwards as an ecumenical figure, or the impact of Edwards on the ecumenical scene, or maybe the impact of the current ecumenical scene on Edwards of old. So there's an agenda there. There's a clear set of parameters that this writer is using. Now, other times it's not quite so obvious. So sticking with Jonathan Edwards, the authors of a book entitled Edwards in Our Time write that their volume is intended, quote, to make a contribution to the timely and challenging enterprise of taking Edwards seriously in the contemporary world. Now, then, the author's agenda is obviously to bring Edwards up to date, to try and examine issues in our day that Edwards might have something to say about. So as you read, you see, your reading becomes more sophisticated. You start to read beneath the text. There is in this particular point the issue of what we sometimes call bias, and if I could use the subsidiary term, confirmatory bias. That should be an I. Confirmatory bias. In other words, the tendency in some readers and some writers to prefer information that reinforces their thinking. That's confirmatory bias. In other words, you're very selective in how you retain information and how you disseminate information. You're a biased person and you're wanting confirmation of it. So, what I'm saying to you is understand that there are writers like that who are guilty of confirmatory bias. Don't you be that person. You be an analytical and critical person. Not necessarily, remember what we said at the beginning? In a spirit of curiosity, not necessarily in a spirit of reproof. So it doesn't mean you have to be that person who disagrees with everybody. If you disagree with everybody, you become rather disagreeable, I think. So I don't want you to be that either, but I want you to be we want you to be an analytical person as you conduct your study. Taking context, purpose and values into account. Now this is a favourite subject of mine, the whole issue of context. And we say this to our students at undergraduate level when they begin their ministry preparation course, particularly in the handling of scripture. We want them to bear in mind context. Context always dictates our understanding of a passage or text, always. And so if you don't understand the original setting, who the author was, to whom he wrote and when, and the circumstances that those people were impacted by, you will not properly understand the text, and then you will not properly preach the text. Context is very important. So this leads us to consider why the author has written the piece. What is his aim, or her aim? One example of this is Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. The title of it is familiar to you, piece of literature, organised around the events of the French Revolution in the 18th century. Various positions of power and authority. So there's Napoleon the pig, for example. What's this all about, we say? What is it all about? It's actually a satirical assault on the Russian Revolution of the 20th century. Who would ever have thought? So who's Napoleon? Stalin. It's a satirical book. There's an underlying context to what George Orwell has written. He was someone who was very opposed to what was happening in Russia at that time in 1917. Now, this also leads us to identify the type of piece the person is writing. Is the piece of writing an essay? Is it a report? Is it a case study? Is it an article? Is it a book? Is it a review? Is it an opinion piece? What is it? Without context, Readers will not see the true picture of a piece of writing without context. So, I suppose what we could say would be this: what are writing? What are the cultural, social, philosophical, and political ideas that are prevalent at the time of writing? Maybe that might be good to take down, actually. What are the cultural, social, philosophical, and political prevalent at the time of writing? So an obvious example of that would be if you the time Bonhoeffer was living and writing. What was happening? Sorry? The Second World War and his imprisonment ultimately in of course there before the end of the war. And so Bonhoeffer's writing in the context of the domination of Germany and in fact of context, you see, without which you will not truly understand what Bonhoeffer is saying. Then, I wouldn't want anybody in class today to think that your experience and your knowledge are not important for this course. They are. Learn a lot of new facts and it'll be important here, and your knowledge, particularly when you come to write more reflective pieces. For example, in some of the pastoral modules, you'll be writing stuff that's a wee bit more reflective of where you've come from and the kind of situations you've encountered. As you study a subject, you develop a knowledge base that enables you to read with a more critical eye, but your own knowledge of the subject grows as well. Realize that just because somebody says something in an academic book doesn't mean it's true. You can say so. Now, the way, in a minute I'll give you an example of how to say something academically. But the way you say it will be, I don't like this argument. That's the way we talk. I mean, if we were having coffee out in the foyer, and somebody said, did you read that book alone, you last? Oh, I didn't like it at all. What did you not like about it? I couldn't make head nor tail of it. This is the way we talk. You're not going to write that in your academic essay. You're going to say, the book lacked substance. The arguments were not weighty. There appear to me to be contrary positions that have not been articulated. Do you see where I'm going? So we don't talk like that over coffee, but that's the way we do our academic work. Now, your background and knowledge, let me just emphasize this one again. Take, for example, the allegation. I'm calling it that. The allegation, the urban setting is sophisticated and the rural setting is not. Okay, I told you the churches I pastored at the beginning of the class. Letterkenny, County Donegal. Mount Pottinger, Belfast, inner Belfast. Coleraine, back to the country, though a larger town. Letterkenny, incidentally, has burgeoned you. I cannot believe what Letterkenny is like today compared to when we were there. When we were there, I looked out one Sunday afternoon, there were sheep grazing on the roundabout. Outside our window. Unbelievable. The change is dramatic. Anyway, the allegation that the urban setting is sophisticated, so people there in the urban setting are thinking people, they're culturally engaged. Rural people are somehow in a backward setting. Can I tell you, the most sophisticated theologian that I ever met was a wee woman who lived in Creeslough, in a wee thatched cottage. When you went in to visit her, the smoke would have choked you. So you had to adjust, you know. And eventually you'd be able to see in the room with the turf smoke. And then you'd start to talk, and you'd begin to realize this woman obviously has done a PhD somewhere. Did she? No. But I can tell you this, when the Jehovah's Witnesses used to call, as they did frequently in Creeslough, this wee woman could tie them in knots on the deity of Christ. So how did she do that? Where had she done her course? She hadn't done any course. She knew Christ, and the Spirit of God made the word clear to her in such a way that she could articulate profound theological concepts in a way that I don't think even she realised she was doing. I never quite met anybody like her in the city. So my experience of that has taught me never to make an assumption about the rural context as opposed to the city. Or for that matter, I suppose you could have a reverse discrimination there, couldn't you? There could be people living in the country who might think inner city Belfast, inner city Dublin, people there are poor, downtrodden and uneducated. They might think that. But is that a sweeping generalisation? Maybe, probably. So I just make that point to emphasise, don't assume and accept unsubstantiated allegations. Your knowledge and experience is very important. And then develop your own perspective. This is a crucial transitional area of critical thinking. Now, at this point, I'm going to ask you to reach for the other handout that you've got, which is entitled, Where Were the Churches of Galatia? You see that one? Where were the churches of Galatia? So as you read, you're gathering information, you're interacting with text, you're building your knowledge base. The next stage is to analyse the material, and this usually takes place when you begin to put your essay together. As you begin to make the step up to postgraduate work, you will find that this is where an important difference lies. You will be expected to develop your own perspective. At undergraduate level, you will probably get away with something like this. So your question is what? Where were the churches of Galatia? Paul writes to the Galatians, and scholars have spilled a lot of ink on this, let me tell you, about where these churches actually were. Some people say northern part of Asia Minor. Asia Minor is modern day Turkey. So it's the northern part of Asia Minor, and then other people say, no, it's obviously the southern part of Asia Minor, and there are all kinds of arguments for this. And one of the arguments, for example, is that the Apostle Paul had a thorn in the flesh. What was that thorn in the flesh? Maybe malaria, which was most common in the northern part of Asia Minor. So if it was malaria, then you can pretty well guess that these churches in Galatia were up there. Well, there are other arguments against that, and my personal view is I think he had an eye issue. He couldn't go to Specsavers in those days, but there you go. Anyway, so where were the churches of Galatia? Now, at undergraduate level, you might get away with this kind of answer. There are two possible views. You see this in your handout? There are two possible views of where the churches of Galatia were situated. Smith favours a North Galatian theory. He argues that the historical situation described in Galatians corresponds with the events of Acts 15:16, which favours a North Galatian view. Brown agrees. He also states that the language used in Romans is close to that used in Galatians, which further supports his theory. Brown, Jones and Black also agree with this. However, Green favours a South Galatian theory based upon Paul's evangelistic strategy and the latest archaeological evidence. Wilson, Watson and Weir agree with Green. Smith's theory seems strongest. Now, I want to tell you, when I read that, I conclude the following two things. First, this student has been reading. So I begin with a positive, right? Okay? I hope that you will find there will always be something positive in your essay that you will be commended for. Okay? And so I conclude this student has done a fair bit of background reading, and I put a tick at that. But then I say, unfortunately, there has been no in-depth analysis of the materials that have been read. So you see, what's happened here is this is pure description. It hasn't scratched onto the surface. Look at the alternative in answer 2. Same question, where were the churches of Galatia? Now, this, by the way, is an example of how to write academically. Don't throw this sheet away. Keep this. And apply the same kind of academic language when you're writing your essays in the future. There are two possible views of where the churches of Galatia were situated, the so-called North and South Galatian theories. The North Galatian theory relies upon an attempt to make the events of Acts 15:16 correspond to the historical situation described in Galatians. However, this is rather forced, and there are critical areas where the two do not correspond. Furthermore, attempts to compare the language used in Romans and Galatians are also weak. They do not show a correspondence in time only, that the same issues were addressed, which explains the similarity in vocabulary. Green points out that what we know of Paul's evangelistic strategy makes it more likely that he visited the southern churches. Whilst this does not settle the case, the latest archaeological evidence, as set out by Lynch, gives considerable weight to the South Galatian theory. Now, what's happened here is that the second person to write, has got under the skin. They've analysed it, they've critiqued it in an academic way. So, the key flaws with the first one were what? You can see this, well, maybe not in your outline, but no, that's the checklist. Let me tell you what the flaws are. The flaws with the first one are, it is not enough to string together lists of references, which the first answer did. Not enough to string together lists of references. This student has simply consulted the books and informed the tutor that there are different views and opinion is divided. The tutor might conclude, by the way, that I could have done this myself. I could have gone and read these books and come to the same conclusion. In fact, the tutor knows that. She reads just saying, telling the tutor something that they know already. Second key flaw, you have not synthesized the views. You set out the two views and have not even reached a conclusion. No, sorry, you have reached a conclusion. However, you have not shown any signs that you have evaluated the claims or that there is any evidence to support your conclusion. So it's about synthesis. What's synthesis, by the way? I maybe should ask that. Phil, you were... Yeah, bringing views together, but then going the step beyond that. Not just synthesize, analyze, and reach your own conclusion. So your answer should look something like the second one. And what you've done in the second one, which I've just read, is to provide evaluation and synthesis, showing the weakness of one argument, setting out the other argument, but in doing so, giving reasons for your own provisional conclusion. And in a sense, that second answer is postgraduate work in a nutshell. You've shown familiarity with the literature, you've shown that you have evaluated it, and you've reached your own reasoned conclusion. Now, I'm going to pause at that point and ask, are there any questions? And then we're going to finish off really with a checklist just at the end, which you've also got on the handout. So, any questions about that exercise on the churches of Galatia? And not the nitty-gritty about where they were, by the way. That's it's the way you address the question. Or any of the other stuff that I've said this morning.
I was just going to ask about, so in both the first and second answers, it sort of talks about the events of Acts 15 and 16, but it doesn't actually mention what those acts were. Is that something that you feel would be necessary when sort of creating an answer, or just...
Yes, it is. Yes, it is, Michael. Sorry, for the benefit of Letitia and Mason, the question was, that Michael has just asked is, there doesn't seem to be any development in the second one of the Acts 15-16 events in correspondence to the question. Would you develop that? Well, yes. What you've got there is really a paraphrase or a précis of what your answer would be. But obviously that can't be a whole essay. You will do more development work in the essay. Anything else at all? Okay, well, on then to the checklist, which I think will come up on the screen okay, and this is the this is the last outline that you have. So the checklist for you in bullet form is, first, who is speaking or writing? I've touched on this already. Second, what is their point of view or perspective? Third, what ideas and information are presented and how are they obtained? This, by the way, is blank sheet of paper stuff. I always advocate using a blank sheet of paper in preparation for any sermon, essay, public presentation. Get a blank sheet of paper. Don't surround yourself initially with the books. Look at the question and get your blank sheet of paper and write down everything you can think of using something like this checklist about that question. Then you start your reading, and your reading is shaped by the structure of this, you see. So what ideas and information are presented? How are they obtained? Are there unsupported assertions? Are reasons or evidence provided? Are the reasons and evidence given relevant? Is the method used to find the evidence sound? Is the evidence correct or valid? What assumptions are made? What is fact and what is opinion? It's a good question. What are the implicit and explicit values of this writer? Are there unreasonable generalizations? Inevitably, you'll come across that in almost any piece of writing. Generalizations. What has been omitted? Are there gaps here? Sometimes in your essay feedback, the tutor will say, there is coherence to this work. Most of the main points are covered. 2 gaps are observable. Points that you didn't deal with that are relevant to the subject area. So is that the case in this book you're reading, this article you're reading? How is the conclusion reached? Is the conclusion reasonable? And what other perspectives or points of view could there be? Good checklist. And I'd say keep that handy whenever you're reading and writing your assignments. Okay.
Sorry,
Yes, go ahead, Phil.
you don't mind me emailing that? It's just
Oh,
in terms of your notes.
is it blank?
No, it's just really, really, really small.
Oh, it's very small. You'd need a magnifying glass. I see. Yes, okay. Yes. Yeah, I'll email that to you. That's okay, because Letitia and Mason have got it emailed, so they're a slight advantage on this one. Okay. Now, what about this? Your slip is showing. I think that was David Luke's title, actually. He's very naughty. But it might be better entitled Common Pitfalls or something like that. I'm a much more sensible person than him. We should also note that an important part of developing your own perspective is being aware of those assumptions that you hold. The problem with us is quite often that we've got blind spots. So here's a story. A North American theologian says that he was giving some lectures in a Latin American country on one occasion, and he left the floor open for questions. This is always the dangerous bit, okay? Leave the floor open for questions. A student put their hand up and said this: how come, Professor, when you speak about theology in Latin America, you call it Latin American theology, but when you refer to North American theology, you just call it theology? Wow. Blind spot. You see? I've done this. Theologians across the globe do this. We talk, for example, about liberation theology. I don't know whether that rings a bell with you. Have you heard of that before? Liberation theology is something that emerged principally in Latin America. And it has now taken over the title, if you like, of Latin American theology. Is that an accurate statement? I don't think so. Liberation theology, by the way, is a theology that understands salvation in ostensibly political and economic deliverance terms. So the poor and oppressed in the world are delivered from this oppression, and salvation is sometimes in the mind of some of these writers, not all of them, but in the mind of some of these writers, equated with that. but some people now call that Latin American theology. Is that a proper ascription? Not really. So we've got to be careful about that. So the result of this approach is that we are often much harder on those with whom we disagree, while listening more sympathetically to those whose position we favour. These assumptions can manifest themselves in a number of different ways. We need to be aware of our denominational bias or our doctrinal bias. Now, you say to me, you're a Baptist? Are you really persuaded about that? Absolutely. I'm in the Irish Baptist College. I'm the principal of this college. I believe that Baptists... I mean, somebody said to me, I've got a great friend called Noel, like you, a Presbyterian minister. He worked the motorbikes with me for a long time, and I always took great delight in saying to Noel, no, you don't have to be a Baptist to get into heaven, but why take a chance? So he enjoyed that greatly. We had good fun. But we need to remember our denominational bias or doctrinal bias can shape the way that we consider arguments. Take, for example, the issue of baptism. I believe in believers' baptism. I don't believe in infant baptism. My good friend Noel Agnew believes in infant baptism. I remember when I was, well, I don't remember when I was born, but my father told me this. When I was born, and he was Gospel Hall in those days, so it was, even a step to the right beyond the Baptist. So at work, the fellows at work all were ribbing him about when the youngster was going to be sprinkled. And so somewhere he got this leaflet on what the Bible teaches about infant baptism. And it was beautifully produced. And when he opened it up, it was blank on the inside. And with great pleasure, he found this, you see, and gave it to these guys. What the Bible teaches about that. Now, we smiled and I laughed. I thought it was funny. But is that a legitimate way to argue for believers' baptism as opposed to infant baptism? Absolutely not. Because there are scholars on both sides who will produce arguments. It's up to us then to critique them and analyse them. That's the point. Don't let our denominational bias or our doctrinal bias affect the way that we consider arguments in an unjustifiable kind of approach. What about our sex? Everybody in this class, the minute physically male, Letitia is watching online, female. Does our view of the role of women reflect our view of masculinity and femininity? So, when we read the story of Mary and Martha in Luke chapter 10, most men hear a story or read a story of how it's important to spend time with Jesus listening to his teaching. A woman might read the story slightly differently. A story of how Jesus sees a woman being a disciple, rather a follower, rather than simply fulfilling cultural expectations for women. So we have to bear in mind that our sex can influence the way that we think. You don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I believe that the Bible has a very clear teaching on the roles of men and women. I believe that. But I don't want to allow my masculinity to interfere with a proper understanding of Scripture as guided by God's Spirit. What about our culture, maybe even more significantly, our white middle-class Western culture? Ask yourself this, you're dealing with a big issue in theology or in society. Ask yourself this, how would this issue look to a poor, persecuted Palestinian Christian? You say, I didn't know there were any. Oh. My wife and I went on a trip to Israel in my middle year at college. We backpacked around Israel. A fascinating experience because we were exposed to meeting people, we were using public transport, exposed to meeting people from both sides of the major divide there. So the Israelis the Palestinians. And then, of course, the Orthodox Jews as well. Wow, that was an experience. But I remember sitting one night in Tel Aviv on, the heat was stifling. It was the month of August. Don't go in August. It was stifling heat. And we're sitting with our backpacks. We were staying in a hostel, Christian hostel actually, in Tel Aviv. And we're sitting on this seat. I think we were getting ready to go. The flight was the next morning or something. And this woman came along and sat down beside us. And she started to talk to us. Where are you from? And we said, where we're from Ireland. And she said, where are you staying? In Tel Aviv. And we told her, oh, she said, you're believers. Interesting. Not just Christians, believers. I thought, this is significant. She told us how she came to know Christ. She told us her life story. She told us the persecution that she was facing from both sides of the divide. The Israelis and the Palestinians, facing persecution, the whole lot. She was a classroom assistant in a local primary school. Her life was tough. So, we talked with her at great length, and then we said, listen, we need to get back to the hostel where our flight's early in the morning. And she said, I will walk with you. And so she walked down the street. And as we walked down the street, thronged with people, she said, we'll sing. I'm not a good singer, but certainly not in public. She said, we'll sing. We said, she said, we'll sing, give me oil in my lamp. A Palestinian Christian lady, believer, and us, walking down the street in Tel Aviv, singing, give me oil in my lamp. Keep me burning. And I thought, this is surreal. This is absolutely surreal. And so, culture. How did issues that I thought were important, how would they appear to her? Would she think they were important? Issues of authority. Issues of what it meant to be a Christian in that setting. Issues of what it meant to be a woman as a Christian in that setting. I knew nothing about this. So it was an eye-opener to us. We still talk about that today and think about her. Marvellous. So our culture, white, middle class, Western, can have a great impact. I had one other note there. Why is the issue of spiritual power so much more important in the context of African Christianity than in the West? Spiritual power. So my brother-in-law has just spent a few years in Zimbabwe with SIM, and the issue of spiritual power there is major. Why would that be, do you think? Somewhere like Zimbabwe. Poor economy. Anything else?
There's the background of like, religion in the area.
Background of religion, but somebody said it? Dictatorship, Robert Mugabe. Power. Power's the big thing. Who has power? Well, most of the people, because of the economy, don't have power. They have nothing. But it's a big issue in many of the African countries. If Nigel Young were here, he'd be saying, which country in Africa? You know, we talk about Africa. They've gone to be a missionary in Africa. Nigel always said, which country in Africa? He's right. But many of the African countries are impacted with this whole issue of spiritual power. People think a lot about that, more so than in our Western society. Our experiences, how do they shape our theology? My experience of church. I have 3 grown-up children. They all go to Anglican churches. Don't know where I went wrong, somewhere along the line, but interesting the spectrum. They're in England. Interesting the spectrum. The eldest fellow and his wife go to a church that's more kind of middle of the road with regard to charismatic issues. The second boy and his wife go to a much more reformed Anglican church, very solidly expository, all of that, not mentioning any names here. And the girl who is musical and sings and leads praise. She's involved in a church that's a Holy Trinity Brompton plant, which is quite charismatic. And whenever I lament about this, my wife says, hang on, think where they might have been. Maybe that's true, might have been away from God, you know. They're all walking with the Lord, thank the Lord for that. But the point I'm making is that our experience and them going to university over there and getting involved in Christian unions and then finding that there were churches in the locality that had exactly the right formula to attract young professional Christians and getting involved there, that makes an impact. I think the Baptists need to learn from this, both over here and across the water. So experience counts for all of this. Finally, building your argument. What are the major building blocks in your argument? This is the realm of essay writing as we draw towards a close. Building blocks. How do they link together? You want to think about how to bring all of this together so that you manage to achieve what we call coherence in essay writing. How do these building blocks point towards your conclusion? In a sense, it's possible, I think I said this, to start with your conclusion. Think of a murder mystery novel. Some people have the irresistible urge to go right to the end to find out who done it. I'd say don't do that, but remember this, the author knows who did it. They wrote the book. And as you write your essay, you know what your conclusion is going to be. You should do. By that stage, you've done all your reading, you've done your analysis, you know who did it. So you can state that actually up front. But if you don't state it up front, at least be aware of where you're going to arrive at the end so that your essay has a very clear conclusion. Here's an example. The title is, of this piece of work, Assess the Influence of John Locke on Jonathan Edwards' View of Salvation. John Locke, famous philosopher. So the answer, this is a précis or a summary in your introduction. For most of the 20th century, the consensus amongst Edwards scholars was that he was deeply indebted to the views of John Locke on the matter of salvation. There can be little doubt that Edwards read Locke and was at points influenced by him. However, to say that Edwards was indebted to Locke for his views on salvation in particular is to overstate the case. Instead, a close reading of Edwards' sermons shows that his views were largely shaped by the Westminster Catechism. Now that's a very good introduction to an essay on that title. The introduction, you will notice, is also the conclusion. You see this on it? Edwards was more influenced by the Westminster Catechism than by Locke. But you're explaining to the reader how you will arrive at that conclusion. You'll do it by, notice at the bottom, a close examination of Edwards' sermons. So you've said, this is the argument. It's not watertight. There are reasons why. And so my conclusion is, and how I'm going to arrive there is by looking at Edwards' sermons. It's very clear. So whoever this student was is going to get a big tick for that. So put in place the building blocks of your argument. Why have scholars taken this view? What are the weaknesses in this view? What are the key elements in Edwards' view? And how do these correspond to the Westminster Catechism? So that's a good slide, that one. I think it would be helpful to you too.
Is that a paragraph of an introduction, or is that the introduction?
That's like, it's almost like a little abstract, almost at the beginning. I would say that would be fine. I mean, if you're talking a 4,000 word essay, you probably want a wee bit more than that in your introduction, Phil, I think. But that'll be the bare bones of it, certainly. And if you get that structure into your essay, you'll not go far wrong. Okay? Now, we conclude then with the very last piece of paper, which I think you should have. which is entitled Differences Between Descriptive and Critical Writing. You find that? Just in the last couple of minutes here. And that's just, again, like the checklist one. You got that, yes? Okay, that's like the checklist piece of paper that you got. So descriptive writing down the left column, compared and contrasted with critical down the right. I don't think I need to go through that. It's pretty self-explanatory. And so at this point, just thank you for listening, and if there are any other questions, I'm happy to field them in the last couple of minutes.
Just on that last one, Evan, if you're going to give some description in your answer.
Yep.
And some critical writing in your answer.
Yes.
What should the weight be?
How long is a piece of string, Steve? You know, it's a difficult answer, a difficult question to answer, that one. I would say that probably the weight is going to be more on description, because you've got to represent fairly what the writer is saying. You can't do that in 3 words. So there's going to be a wee bit more weight on that. But if it's all that, then it's not going to get a good mark. It has to analyse. Now, the question is also sometimes asked, just you've triggered me on this, the question is sometimes asked, do you do all your descriptive stuff and then have a big section at the end on critique? Maybe. Another way of doing it is to take the arguments in description and address them as you go along. You know, there are different ways to skin a cat here in this. So I would say you could experiment with both, see how it goes. But I would say the bulk of it is going to be your more descriptive, fair representation of what the writer is saying. And then, is it 60, 40, 70, 30? Hard to tell. So long as there is a good sense that this student, in addressing this question, has got underneath the skin of it and is really asking significant questions. Is that fair? Anything else? Well, okay, thank you very much for your attention this morning, and thank you to Letitia and to Mason. I hope that has been okay for you as well. And then it's lunchtime now, and then we resume at what time? 1:45. At 1:45. Okay, so thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Everybody.